The air was thick with tension as Eric and Jenny pored over the evidence they had gathered. The USB drive that Eric had obtained from the police contained a treasure trove of information, but sifting through it all was a painstaking process. They had spent hours combing through financial records, surveillance footage, and incriminating documents, piecing together the intricate web of corruption that had enveloped the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association. The more they uncovered, the more they realized the depth of Vanessa's depravity. "This is worse than we thought," Jenny murmured, her brow furrowed in concentration as she scanned through a stack of invoices. "The HOA has been skimming millions from the community funds and using the money to line their own pockets." Eric nodded grimly, his gaze fixed on the computer screen in front of him. "And that's just the tip of the iceberg," he said, his voice low and strained. "There's evidence of illegal surveillance, intimidation tactics, and even ties to organized crime." Jenny let out a frustrated sigh, leaning back in her chair as she pinched the bridge of her nose. "God, this is a mess," she muttered. "If we go public with this, it's going to be a complete shitstorm." Eric's expression hardened and he reached out to squeeze her hand reassuringly. "I know," he said, his voice steady and resolved. "But we have to do this, Jenny. Vanessa and the HOA have been getting away with this for too long, and it's time to put a stop to it." Jenny nodded, her gaze meeting his with a fierce determination. "You're right," she said, her voice firm. "But we need to be careful. Vanessa and her cronies are not going to go down without a fight, and they'll stop at nothing to protect their empire." Eric's eyes narrowed and he leaned forward, his expression grim. "I'm ready for them," he said, his voice laced with a hint of defiance. "I'm not going to let them intimidate me anymore. It's time to take the fight to them." Jenny's expression softened, and she reached out to squeeze his hand. "I know you are," she said, her voice gentle. "But we need to be smart about this. We can't just charge in blindly. We need a plan, a strategy that will give us the best chance of taking Vanessa down for good." Eric nodded, his brow furrowing in deep thought. "Okay, then let's start with the police," he said, his voice low and focused. "We need to get them fully on board with this investigation and make sure they have all the evidence they need to bring charges against Vanessa and the HOA." Jenny's eyes widened and she leaned forward, her expression filled with a cautious optimism. "That's a good idea," she said, her voice quickening with excitement. "If we can get the cops to take this seriously, it'll put a lot of pressure on Vanessa and her cronies." Eric nodded, his gaze shifting to the stack of documents on the table. "And in the meantime, we'll keep digging," he said, his voice resolute. "There has to be more information out there that we can use to take them down." Jenny's expression hardened and she reached out to squeeze his hand. "We'll get them, Eric," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "I promise you we'll bring Vanessa and the HOA to their knees." Eric felt a surge of hope and determination coursing through him, and he nodded, his gaze fixed on Jenny's with a newfound sense of purpose. "Then let's get to work," he said, his voice filled with a steely resolve. As the two of them set to work, the air around them crackled with the promise of a battle to come. A battle that would pit the forces of corruption against the power of truth and justice, and one that would determine the fate of Oakwood Hills once and for all. The sound of sirens pierced the night air, drawing Vanessa's attention away from the standoff unfolding in the restaurant. Her eyes narrowed as she realized that the police were approaching, their lights flashing through the rain-soaked streets. Panic flickered across her face and she turned to the gunman, her voice sharp with urgency. "What's going on out there?" she demanded. The gunman hesitated, his grip on the weapon wavering. I don't know," he stammered, his eyes darting nervously towards the entrance. Eric watched the exchange, his heart pounding in his chest. This was his chance, his opportunity to turn the tables on Vanessa and her goons. With a quick glance around the room, he spotted a heavy glass tumbler on the table beside him. Gripping it tightly, he tensed, ready to strike. Vanessa's gaze swept the room, her expression hardening as she realized that her carefully orchestrated plan was unraveling. "Forget the police," she snapped, her voice low and dangerous. "Take care of him now." The gunman's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Eric swung the glass with all his might, shattering it against the man's hand. The gun clattered to the floor, and the gunman howled in pain, clutching his wounded hand. The two burly men surged forward, their fists raised, but Eric was already in motion. He ducked and weaved, his agility and training allowing him to evade their blows. Vanessa watched in growing fury as her plans crumbled around her, her carefully constructed web of control unraveling with each passing moment. The sound of the sirens grew louder, and Vanessa knew that time was running out. She needed to regain control of the situation, and she needed to do it fast. Scanning the room, her gaze settled on a small table near the entrance, a decorative vase sitting atop it. With a fluid motion, Vanessa grabbed the vase and hefted it in her hand, her expression hardening with determination. As the two men continued their pursuit of Eric, she stepped forward, her arm drawing back, ready to hurl the vase with all her might. But before she could make her move, a sudden commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. The doors burst open, and a group of uniformed officers flooded into the restaurant, their weapons drawn. "Freeze!" One of the officers shouted, his voice booming through the stunned silence. "Hands in the air now." Vanessa froze, the vase slipping from her grasp and shattering on the floor. The two burly men immediately raised their hands, the fight gone from their eyes. Eric, his chest heaving, turned to face the officers, his expression a mixture of relief and trepidation. As the officers moved in to make the arrests, Vanessa's gaze locked with Eric's, a deadly promise lurking in the depths of her eyes. "This isn't over, Mr. Sinclair," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll make you pay for this, I swear it." Eric held her gaze, his own expression hardening with determination. "We'll see about that, Vanessa," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. The officers moved in, their handcuffs gleaming in the dim light. Vanessa and her goons were quickly subdued, their protestations falling on deaf ears. As they were led away, the restaurant erupted into a flurry of activity, the patrons murmuring and whispering, their expressions a mix of shock and awe. Eric stood alone, his eyes fixed on the retreating figures of Vanessa and her henchmen. He knew that this was only the beginning, that the battle for control of Oakwood Hills was far from over. But for now, he had won a small victory. He was determined to ensure that it would not be his last. As the police officers secured the scene, Eric couldn't help but wonder what other secrets Vanessa and her HOA were hiding. He had a feeling that the answers would come at a heavy price, but he was more than willing to pay it. After all, the stakes had never been higher. He was determined to emerge victorious, no matter the cost. The tense silence that had enveloped the restaurant was shattered by the sound of the police officers barking orders and the frantic murmurs of the onlookers. Eric stood in the midst of the chaos, his gaze fixed on the retreating figures of Vanessa and her henchmen as they were led away in handcuffs. As the officers secured the scene, Eric couldn't help but feel a sense of relief and triumph. He had finally stood up to Vanessa and her HOA, refusing to back down in the face of their intimidation tactics. But even as the adrenaline began to wear off, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. Turning his attention to the uniformed officers, Eric stepped forward, his expression sober and determined. "Officer, I need to speak with you," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. The officer, a seasoned veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor, turned to face him, his brow furrowed in a slight frown. "What is it, sir?" he asked, his tone clipped and professional. "I have information that could be crucial to your investigation," Eric replied, his gaze never wavering. "Vanessa and the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association are involved in a much deeper level of corruption than you know." The officer's eyes narrowed and he gestured for Eric to follow him to a quieter corner of the restaurant. "Go on," he said, his tone a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Eric took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to put together the pieces of the puzzle he had uncovered. The HOA has been using its power to intimidate and control the residents of Oakwood Hills, he began, his voice low and urgent. "They've been levying exorbitant fines, manipulating the rules, and even using threats and violence to maintain their grip on the community." The officer's expression darkened and he nodded slowly. "We've been getting complaints about the HOA for years, but nothing concrete enough to warrant a full-scale investigation," he said. "What makes you think you have something different?" Eric's eyes narrowed and a steely determination flickered across his features. "Because I've been doing my own investigation," he said, his voice laced with a hint of pride. "I've uncovered evidence of financial mismanagement, illegal surveillance, and even ties to organized crime." The officer's brows shot up, his expression shifting from skepticism to genuine interest. "That's a pretty serious accusation," he said, his tone cautious. "Do you have any proof to back that up?" Eric nodded, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small USB drive. "Everything you need is right here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I've been gathering evidence for months, and I'm ready to take Vanessa and the HOA down for good." The officer took the drive, his expression shifting from one of caution to one of determination. "All right, Mr. Sinclair," he said, his voice firm. "We'll take a look at this and see what we can find. In the meantime, I suggest you stay low and keep your head down. Vanessa and her cronies are not going to take us lying down." Eric nodded, his expression grim. "I figured as much," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of resignation. "But I'm not backing down, not this time. They pushed me too far and I'm ready to fight back." The officer placed a hand on Eric's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "I understand," he said, his voice low and serious. "Just be careful, okay? This is a dangerous game you're playing and the stakes are higher than you know." As the officer turned to rejoin his team, Eric couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation and trepidation. He knew that he was standing on the precipice of a major confrontation, one that could have far-reaching consequences for the entire community, but he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, he steeled himself for the battles to come. knowing that the fate of Oakwood Hills was now in his hands. The air was thick with tension as Eric left the police station, his mind buzzing with the weight of the information he had just shared. He knew that he had taken a huge risk by reaching out to the authorities, but the stakes had never been higher. The corruption and deceit that had been festering within the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association had to be exposed, no matter the cost. As he stepped out into the cold night air, Eric couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He knew that Vanessa and her cronies would not take this lying down, and he needed to be prepared for their inevitable retaliation. Pulling out his phone, he quickly dialed a number, his fingers trembling slightly. "Hey, it's me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I think we need to talk. It's about the HOA." On the other end of the line, a familiar voice responded, its tone laced with concern. "What happened, Eric? Are you okay?" "I'm fine for now," Eric replied, his gaze darting nervously around the deserted street. "But I've just made a move against Vanessa and the HOA, and I have a feeling you're not going to be happy about it." There was a brief pause, and then the voice on the other end spoke again, its tone resolute. "What do you need me to do?" Eric couldn't help but feel a surge of relief at the unwavering support of his friend. "I need you to dig deeper into the HOA's financial records," he said, his voice quickening with urgency. "I've already given the police some information, but I have a feeling there's a lot more going on beneath the surface." "Consider it done," the voice responded, its owner's commitment clear. "Just be careful, Eric. Vanessa and her people are dangerous, and they're not going to let this go easily." Eric nodded, even though he knew his friend couldn't see him. "I know," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of fear. "That's why I need you to keep this quiet for now. I don't want to put you in any more danger than you already are." "Danger?" the voice echoed, its tone suddenly sharp. "Eric, what have you gotten yourself into?" Eric hesitated, his gaze darting around the shadowy street once more. "It's a long story," he said, his voice low and strained. "But the short version is that I'm going to war with the HOA, and I need all the help I can get." There was another brief pause, and then the voice on the other end spoke again, its tone resolute. "All right, Eric. Whatever you need, I'm here for you. Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Eric replied, his voice tinged with a hint of gratitude. "Thanks, man. I owe you one." With that, he ended the call, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he was taking a huge risk, not just for himself but for everyone he cared about, but he also knew that he couldn't back down, not now. Steeling himself for the battles to come, Eric began to make his way home, his gaze constantly sweeping the area for any signs of danger. He couldn't shake the feeling that Vanessa and her cronies were watching him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As he turned the corner onto his street, he couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. The normally well-lit neighborhood seemed eerily quiet, and the shadows seemed to loom larger than ever before. Quickening his pace, Eric hurried towards his house, his heart pounding in his chest. But just as he reached the front door, a sudden movement in the darkness caught his eye. Whirling around, he found himself face to face with a group of men, their expressions hard and their eyes glinting with menace. Eric's blood ran cold as he realized that he had walked straight into a trap, and this time there was no one to come to his rescue. Panic surged through Eric's veins as he found himself surrounded by Vanessa's henchmen, their imposing figures blocking any chance of escape. He took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing to find a way out of this predicament. But the men were relentless, their steps closing in on him with each passing moment. Eric knew that he was outmatched both in size and in numbers, but he refused to surrender without a fight. Clenching his fists, he braced himself for the inevitable confrontation, his eyes darting around the dimly lit street in search of any potential weapon or means of escape. But the shadows seemed to close in around him, and the sound of the men's heavy footsteps echoed in his ears like the steady beat of a funeral march. Just as the men were about to pounce, a sudden movement in the darkness caught their attention. A figure emerged from the shadows, their silhouette barely visible in the gloom. Eric felt a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly extinguished as he recognized the familiar form of Vanessa, her expression twisted into a cruel smile. "Well, well, well," she purred, her voice dripping with malice. "If it isn't my dear friend, Mr. Sinclair, I must say, I'm impressed that you managed to evade the police for this long." Eric's jaw tightened and he glared at Vanessa with unrestrained defiance. "What do you want, Vanessa?" he demanded, his voice low and guttural. Vanessa's smile widened and she moved closer, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. "What do I want?" she echoed, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Why, I want you to leave Oakwood Hills and never come back." Eric felt a surge of anger rise within him, and he took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "Not a chance," he growled. "I'm not going anywhere, and you can't stop me from exposing your corruption." Vanessa's expression darkened and she gestured to the men surrounding Eric. "Oh, I think we can," she said, her voice low and menacing. You see, Mr. Sinclair, I have a lot of friends in this town, and they're more than willing to help me deal with pesky little troublemakers like you. The men moved in closer, their bodies blocking any possible escape route. Eric's heart raced, and he knew that he was running out of options. He could try to fight his way out, but the odds were heavily stacked against him. Just as the men were about to pounce, a sudden commotion in the distance caught everyone's attention. The sound of sirens pierced the night air, and Vanessa's expression quickly shifted from one of triumph to one of panic. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice shrill and urgent. One of the men stepped forward, his face pale with fear. "I don't know," he stammered, "but we need to get out of here now." Vanessa's eyes narrowed, and she glared at Eric with unbridled fury. "This isn't over, Sinclair," she hissed. "Mark my words, I will destroy you and everything you hold dear." Without another word, Vanessa and her henchmen disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Eric alone on the deserted street. He stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind reeling from the intensity of the encounter. As the sound of the sirens grew closer, Eric knew that he had to act fast. He couldn't stay here, not when Vanessa and her cronies were still out there, plotting their next move. Quickly, he turned and hurried towards his house, his mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios. He knew that he was in for the fight of his life, but he was more determined than ever to bring Vanessa and the HOA down, no matter the cost. Eric burst through the door of his home, his heart pounding in his chest. He quickly locked the door behind him, his gaze darting nervously around the room as he tried to catch his breath. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, and he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in the pit of his stomach. Vanessa and her henchmen had come dangerously close to getting their hands on him, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before they struck again. Crossing the room, he moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the distant sound of sirens. He couldn't help but wonder what had drawn the police to the area, and whether they had managed to apprehend Vanessa and her cronies. A sudden movement in the shadows caught his eye, and he froze, his heart pounding in his chest. But as the figure stepped into the dim light, he recognized the familiar face of his friend Jenny. Relief flooded through him, and he quickly opened the door, ushering her inside. "Jenny, thank God you're here," he said, his voice tinged with a mixture of fear and gratitude. Jenny's eyes were wide with concern, and she reached out to grip his arm. "Eric, what's going on?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. "I got your call, and I came as soon as I could." Eric quickly filled her in on the events of the evening, his words tumbling out in a rush as he tried to convey the urgency of the situation. Jenny listened intently, her expression darkening with each passing moment. "This is worse than I thought," she murmured, her brow furrowed in deep thought. "Vanessa and the HOA are even more corrupt than we imagined." Eric nodded, his gaze fixed on her with a mix of hope and desperation. "I know," he said, his voice strained. "That's why I need your help, Jenny. I can't take them on alone, not this time." Jenny's expression hardened as she reached out to squeeze his hand. "You won't have to," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "I'm in this with you, Eric. Whatever it takes to bring Vanessa and the HOA down, I'm here." Eric felt a surge of relief and gratitude wash over him, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As they pulled apart, Jenny's gaze fell on the USB drive that Eric had given to the police. "So, what's on that drive?" she asked, her eyes narrowing with a hint of curiosity. Eric's expression darkened, and he shook his head. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "All I know is that it contains evidence of the HOA's corruption, financial mismanagement, illegal surveillance, and even ties to organized crime." Jenny's eyes widened, and she let out a low whistle. "Damn," she murmured. "If that's true, then we're dealing with something much bigger than we ever imagined." Eric nodded, his mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios. "Which means we need to be even more careful," he said, his voice low and serious. "Vanessa and her cronies are not going to take this lying down, and they'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried." Jenny's expression hardened, and she reached out to grasp his hand. "Then we'll have to be one step ahead of them," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We'll dig deeper, uncover every last shred of evidence, and bring them down once and for all." Eric felt a surge of hope and resolve coursing through him, and he nodded, his gaze fixed on Jenny's with a newfound sense of purpose. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. As the two of them set to work, the air around them crackled with the promise of a battle to come, a battle that would pit the forces of corruption against the power of truth and justice. The air was thick with tension as Eric and Jenny pored over the evidence they had gathered. The USB drive that Eric had obtained from the police contained a treasure trove of information, but sifting through it all was a painstaking process. They had spent hours combing through financial records, surveillance footage, and incriminating documents, piecing together the intricate web of corruption that had enveloped the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association. The more they uncovered, the more they realized the depth of Vanessa's depravity. "This is worse than we thought," Jenny murmured, her brow furrowed in concentration as she scanned through a stack of invoices. The HOA has been skimming millions from the community funds and using the money to line their own pockets. Eric nodded grimly, his gaze fixed on the computer screen in front of him. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, he said, his voice low and strained. There's evidence of illegal surveillance, intimidation tactics, and even ties to organized crime. Jenny let out a frustrated sigh, leaning back in her chair as she pinched the bridge of her nose. God, this is a mess, she muttered. If we go public with this, it's going to be a complete shitstorm. Eric's expression hardened and he reached out to squeeze her hand reassuringly. I know, he said, his voice steady and resolved. But we have to do this, Jenny. Vanessa and the HOA have been getting away with this for too long, and it's time to put a stop to it. Jenny nodded, her gaze meeting his with a fierce determination. You're right, she said, her voice firm. But we need to be careful. Vanessa and her cronies are not going to go down without a fight, and they'll stop at nothing to protect their empire. Eric's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his expression grim. I'm ready for them, he said, his voice laced with a hint of defiance. I'm not going to let them intimidate me anymore. It's time to take the fight to them. Jenny's expression softened, and she reached out to squeeze his hand. I know you are, she said, her voice gentle. But we need to be smart about this. We can't just charge in blindly. We need a plan, a strategy that will give us the best chance of taking Vanessa down for good. Eric nodded, his brow furrowing in deep thought. Okay, then let's start with the police, he said, his voice low and focused. We need to get them fully on board with this investigation and make sure they have all the evidence they need to bring charges against Vanessa and the HOA. Jenny's eyes widened and she leaned forward, her expression filled with a cautious optimism. That's a good idea, she said, her voice quickening with excitement. If we can get the cops to take this seriously, it'll put a lot of pressure on Vanessa and her cronies. Eric nodded, his gaze shifting to the stack of documents on the table. And in the meantime, we'll keep digging, he said, his voice resolute. There has to be more information out there that we can use to take them down. Jenny's expression hardened and she reached out to squeeze his hand. We'll get them, Eric, she said, her voice filled with conviction. I promise you, we'll bring Vanessa and the HOA to their knees. Eric felt a surge of hope and determination coursing through him, and he nodded, his gaze fixed on Jenny's with a newfound sense of purpose. Then let's get to work, he said, his voice filled with a steely resolve. As the two of them set to work, the air around them crackled with the promise of a battle to come. A battle that would pit the forces of corruption against the power of truth and justice, and one that would determine the fate of Oakwood Hills once and for all. The tension in the air was palpable as Eric and Jenny prepared to confront Vanessa and the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association. They had spent countless hours poring over the evidence they had gathered, meticulously building their case against the corrupt organization. Now, with the backing of the police and a mountain of damning evidence, they were ready to take the fight to Vanessa and her cronies. The stakes had never been higher, and they knew that the outcome of this battle would have far-reaching consequences for the entire community. As they stepped out into the darkened streets of Oakwood Hills, Eric couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. Vanessa and the HOA had proven themselves to be ruthless and relentless, and he knew that they would stop at nothing to protect their empire. But he also felt a deep sense of determination, a resolve that had been forged in the crucible of their long, arduous struggle. He was no longer the scared and intimidated homeowner that Vanessa had once sought to control. He was a warrior, a strategist, and a force to be reckoned with. Jenny walked beside him, her expression hard and her gaze unwavering. She had been by his side every step of the way, and he knew that he could count on her to have his back no matter what. Together, they were an unstoppable force, and they were ready to bring Vanessa and the HOA to their knees. As they approached the heavily fortified gates of the Oakwood Hills community, they could see the telltale signs of Vanessa's presence. The network of surveillance cameras, the heavily armed security guards, and the ominous sense of foreboding that hung in the air. Eric took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation that lay ahead. This is it, he said, his voice low and steady. Are you ready? Jenny nodded, her expression grim but resolute. I'm with you all the way, she replied, her hand reaching out to grip his in a gesture of solidarity. Together, they stepped through the gates, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The security guards immediately moved to intercept them, their hands hovering over their weapons. Stop right there, one of the guards barked, his voice gruff and menacing. You're not allowed in here. Eric stepped forward, his expression unflinching. We're here to see Vanessa, he said, his voice calm and measured. And we're not leaving until we've had our say. The guard's brow furrowed, and he exchanged a quick glance with his colleague. Vanessa doesn't see anyone without an appointment, he growled, his hand tightening on the grip of his gun. Eric's eyes narrowed, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small USB drive. "I think she'll want to see this," he said, his voice laced with a hint of defiance. The guard hesitated, his gaze shifting from the USB drive to Eric's face. There was a moment of tense silence, and then the sound of a door opening drew their attention. Vanessa emerged from the shadows, her expression a mix of shock and fury. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. Eric stepped forward, his grip on the USB drive tightening. "Vanessa, we need to talk," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "We have evidence of your corruption, and we're here to bring you down." Vanessa's eyes narrowed and a dangerous smile spread across her lips. "Evidence," she echoed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You really think a little USB drive is going to bring me down?" Eric held her gaze, his expression resolute. "We've got the police on our side," he said, his voice low and confident. "And we're not the only ones who know about your dirty little secrets." Vanessa's smile faltered and a flicker of fear passed across her features. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could utter a word, the sound of sirens in the distance drew everyone's attention. Eric and Jenny exchanged a quick glance, their hearts pounding in their chests. The moment of truth had arrived, and they were ready to face whatever came their way. As the sirens grew louder, Vanessa's expression shifted from one of defiance to one of pure terror. She knew that her reign of power was about to come crashing down, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The future of Oakwood Hills hung in the balance, and Eric and Jenny were determined to seize it, no matter the cost.